I found the letter on a Thursday evening, tucked inside a cookbook we hadn't used in 2 years. That detail still bothers me. Not the letter itself, though what it said was bad enough, but the cookbook. It was a thick, expensive thing Camille had bought at an airport bookstore early in our marriage, full of recipes she'd sworn she would eventually try. It had lived on the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet ever since, undisturbed, a symbol of good intentions that never quite materialized. And she had chosen it, specifically, as the place to leave a letter explaining why she was leaving me. I hadn't been looking for it. I'd been looking for a jar of oregano. My name is Elliot. I was 36 that autumn. I worked a desk job at a mid-sized corporate firm, the kind of work that fills the hours completely and is almost impossible to describe at dinner without watching someone's eyes go politely blank. I was not unhappy in it. I was not particularly passionate about it either. It was the scaffolding of the life Camille and I had built. It paid the mortgage, it kept the car running, it put food in the refrigerator that we occasionally remembered to cook. Camille and I had been together for 7 years, married for 4. We had a daughter, 8 months old that autumn, still at the stage where she smelled like milk and warm skin and something indefinably new, where the weight of her in your arms felt like the most real thing in the world. We had named her together, argued gently about it for weeks, landed on something we both loved. I won't say her name here. Some things deserve protection. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten. Camille had neat, deliberate handwriting, the kind that looked like she had thought about each letter before committing it to the page. The letter was written in that same neat hand, and it said, in carefully chosen language, that she needed space, that she felt she had lost herself, that the life we were living felt like a closing in rather than a building up, that she loved me but was not sure what that love meant anymore, that she needed time away to think clearly, to find her footing, to understand what she wanted. She had not mentioned our daughter once in 2 pages. I read the letter standing at the kitchen counter. I read it twice. Then I folded it precisely along its original creases and placed it back inside the cookbook and put the cookbook back on the shelf. I don't know why I did that. Some instinct toward order in the middle of disorder, maybe. I made dinner. I fed our daughter her evening bottle. I bathed her and put her down. I sat in the living room in the dark for a long time after that. Camille came home at 11. She looked at me from the doorway with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Not guilt, not apology, but something more clinical, evaluative. She was watching to see what I would do. I found it, I said. She nodded once. She sat down in the chair across from me, not on the sofa beside me where she always sat, and she folded her hands in her lap and said, I need you to understand that this isn't about you failing at anything. And something in me, some quiet, interior thing I couldn't have named, went completely still. The trouble, I now understand, had been arriving for a long time before that Thursday. In the months after our daughter was born, Camille changed in ways I attributed entirely to new parenthood. She became quieter, more internal. She stopped initiating conversations the way she used to, the easy, wandering evening conversations that had always been one of the things I loved most about being with her. Those conversations had dried up gradually, replaced by the logistics of feeding schedules and pediatric appointments and the kind of exhausted shorthand that new parents develop out of necessity. I told myself this was normal. Every couple I knew who had recently had a child described something similar. You lose each other temporarily in the enormity of a new person, and then you find each other again on the other side. But there were specific things that didn't fit the new parenthood explanation, and I filed them away under the wrong category. The gym, for instance. Camille had never been a gym person. She liked walking long urban walks with headphones in, sometimes with the stroller in the early months. She had the kind of physical restlessness that preferred movement to exercise, outdoors to machines. Then, when our daughter was around 5 months old, she joined a gym. A specific gym, one that was 20 minutes away by car rather than the one 7 minutes from our house. She went 3 evenings a week, sometimes 4. She came home flushed and energized and briefly, almost uncomfortably, talkative, a sudden warmth that faded by the time she'd showered and come to bed. I noticed. I told myself it was good. She was taking care of herself, carving out time that was hers, doing exactly what every article about new parent well-being told you to do. Then there was the name Weston. She mentioned him once, casually, in the kitchen on a Sunday morning. He was someone from the gym, she said. A regular. Good at the classes. She said it while making coffee, her back to me, her tone perfectly flat. I said something noncommittal. She didn't bring him up again. But I noticed, and this is the thing I cannot fully explain, that she stopped mentioning the gym itself after that. Before Weston, she had talked about it the way people talk about new habits they're proud of, casually, frequently, without performance. After the mention of his name, the gym became a place she simply went and returned from, absent from conversation, as if it had always been that way. I didn't connect any of this to anything. Not yet. What I connected it to was stress, to the adjustment of new parenthood, to Camille's lifelong tendency, one I had always found interesting rather than alarming, to retreat inward when she was working through something. She had always needed more solitude than I did. I had always given it freely, because it was hers to ask for. The phone was something else. I am not a man who monitors his partner's phone. That is not a virtue I'm claiming. It is simply a description of who I am. I had never once felt the need to look at Camille's messages, and she had never given me cause to. Our relationship had been, for most of its duration, genuinely open in the way that meant openness was never discussed because it was never in question. So, when I noticed the phone behavior change, it landed strangely, not as a sudden alarm, but as a low-frequency wrongness I couldn't locate precisely. She began carrying it into other rooms when it buzzed. She began angling the screen away as a reflex. She started sleeping with it face down on her nightstand, which she had never done before. Once, very late, I woke and heard her typing. The light from the screen made a thin bar under the bathroom door. She was in there for 20 minutes. When she came back to bed, she said she couldn't sleep and had been reading. Her voice had the careful quality of a sentence that had been composed in advance. I lay in the dark and listened to her breathing slow towards sleep and thought, she seems far away. I thought, she has seemed far away for a while. I thought nothing else. I turned over. I slept. The Thursday evening with the cookbook came 3 weeks after that night. After Camille left, she went to stay with a friend. She said, no address offered, no timeline given. I operated in a state I can only describe as functional numbness. I went to work. I came home. I took care of our daughter with a focus that surprised me, as if the smallness and the completeness of her needs gave me something to organize myself around. She was 8 months old and she needed feeding and warmth and the particular quality of attention that babies require before they can ask for it, and I gave her all of it. It was in this period that I began, quietly and almost involuntarily, to reconstruct the past several months. Not obsessively, not with an investigator's intensity, more the way you reread a book after finding out the ending and suddenly see the foreshadowing everywhere, a passive, backward-moving clarity that assembles itself without being asked. The gym 20 minutes away instead of 7. Weston, mentioned once and then never again. The late-night typing. The phone angled away. The new energy she'd carried home on gym evenings. The warmth that faded before bed. The way she'd said, in the kitchen that last night, this isn't about you failing at anything. A sentence so precisely calibrated to be kind that it had the opposite effect, because kindness that precise is the product of rehearsal. I called a mutual acquaintance, someone who moved in overlapping social circles, the kind of peripheral friend who knew many people without being close to any of them. I asked, without explanation, whether they knew anyone named Weston from the gym scene. The acquaintance thought for a moment and then said yes. Actually, tall guy, mid-30s, recently out of a long relationship, friendly, bit of a fixture at fitness classes. Does he know Camille? I asked. A pause. Careful. I think they know each other, yeah? From the gym. The pause told me more than the answer. I didn't push further. I thanked them and ended the call. I sat with what I knew, or suspected, and I made a decision that surprised me. I was not going to investigate. Not because I was certain there was nothing to find, but because I had already begun to understand, in some quiet, fundamental way, that the state of the relationship was not contingent on the details of what Camille had or hadn't done. She had left. She had left with a letter in a cookbook and our daughter 8 months old and a sentence about not failing. Whatever had driven her there, affair, emotional withdrawal, simple exhaustion with the life we'd built, the damage was the same shape regardless. What I decided to do instead was to stop. Stop waiting. Stop constructing reasons why she might come back. Stop treating the apartment as a place on pause, a held breath. I repainted the hallway, which I had been meaning to do for 2 years. I reorganized the kitchen. I threw away the cookbook. It was around this time that I met Kara. She worked in a different department at my firm, project delivery, practical and calm, the kind of person whose presence in a meeting made things slightly less chaotic without her having to say very much. We had known each other to nod at for a year. She started stopping by my desk occasionally, nothing significant, a question about a shared document, a comment about a project, and those brief conversations had the quality of things that were easy in a way I had almost forgotten conversation could be. I wasn't looking for anything. I was very specifically not looking for anything. But I noticed that I looked forward to those conversations in a way that felt like a small, ordinary light in a room that had been getting gradually darker. Camille, meanwhile, sent occasional messages. Not daily, every few days, sometimes longer. They had a quality I recognized but couldn't immediately name. They were warm without being affectionate. They asked about our daughter while touching nothing that mattered. They were, I eventually understood, breadcrumbs, small, regular reminders of her existence, designed to keep me oriented toward her while she figured out what she wanted. I responded to the ones about our daughter. I didn't respond to the rest. Then she called, unexpectedly, on a Tuesday evening. Her voice had a different register than the messages, less controlled, slightly rough at the edges. "How are you really doing?" she asked. "I'm okay," I said, genuinely. A silence. I could hear something working in it, an expectation not being met. "You sound different," she said. "Do I?" "Elliot," she stopped. "I just want you to know I think about you. About us. I'm still working through things. Take the time you need," I said. And I meant it. Not with generosity exactly, with something more neutral. She was working through things. That was her process. Mine was happening separately, in a different direction. After I hung up, I sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen and noticed, with some surprise, that the call had produced almost nothing in me. No longing, no anger, no hope, just a kind of calm recognition that we were now, whatever else was true, on entirely different trajectories. I didn't know yet how much that calmness would unsettle her. 3 months after Camille left, she came back. Not to move in, to visit our daughter, which was right and which I had encouraged. But the visits had a quality that went beyond parenting. She arrived looking carefully put together, the specific effort of someone who wants to appear effortless. She lingered. She found small reasons to stay, an extra bottle feed, a question about the pediatrician, the gradual way of someone trying to reinsert themselves into the ambient life of a home they'd left. I was cordial. I was warm when warmth was about her daughter. I was not available in the way she seemed to be expecting. It was during this period that a name came up again. Not Weston, a different name, offered this time by Melissa, a colleague from HR who knew Camille socially and who appeared at my desk one afternoon with the particular expression of someone carrying information they're not sure they should deliver. "I don't want to overstep," she said. "Then don't," I said, not unkindly. "Unless you think I need to know." She considered this. Then, "Camille's been spending time with someone. From the gym. I don't know how serious it is or was. I just thought, with the baby and everything." She stopped. "I'm sorry. I don't know if that helps or hurts." "It clarifies," I said. It did clarify. Not painfully. More the way the last piece of a puzzle clarifies. The picture was already visible. The piece just completed its border. The gym 20 minutes away. The late typing. The carefully worded letter that managed to not once mention their child. The breadcrumb messages sent to maintain my orbit while she determined which direction to move. Weston, it turned out, had not been as interested in sustained involvement as Camille had perhaps anticipated. This was inference on my part. I had no direct information. But the timing mapped. Her contact with me had grown warmer and more frequent in the weeks after what Melissa was describing, the trajectory of someone who had reached for something that hadn't caught. I didn't confront Camille with any of this. There was nothing to confront. She hadn't lied to me directly. She had simply left, and left a letter, and the letter had been honest in its way even if it had been incomplete. What she had done before and after the leaving was hers to live with. What I was more interested in, during this period, was something I had only recently started to understand about myself. I had spent years, not unhappily, but automatically, orienting my inner life toward Camille. Not in a dependent or anxious way, but in the quiet, habitual way of someone who has organized themselves around another person for so long that the organization becomes invisible. When she left, The orientation had nothing to point at. And in the absence of that familiar pointing toward, I discovered that the space it had occupied was not empty. It was available. The conversations with Kara had continued. We had begun having lunch occasionally, nothing deliberate, just two people whose schedules aligned and who found each other's company easy. She knew, broadly, that I was going through a separation. She didn't ask questions I hadn't invited. She was present in a way that made no demands of the future, and that quality, presence without demand, was something I had not known I was hungry for. I want to be precise here. Nothing happened between Kara and me during this period that was anything other than friendship. But the friendship was growing into something I recognized as significant, and I think Camille recognized it too, though I had said nothing and done nothing that could be named. She had always been perceptive about me in ways she did not apply equally to herself. One evening she came to collect our daughter for a weekend visit and found me on the phone, laughing at something. I was standing at the kitchen window, unaware she'd arrived until I turned and saw her in the doorway. Key in the lock, our daughter in her car seat by the door, watching me with an expression I had never quite seen on her face before. Not anger, not jealousy exactly. Something more uncomfortable than either. The expression of someone seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time, the consequences of a choice they'd made. I ended the call. I was perfectly pleasant. I helped her get our daughter's bag ready. I walked them out. She paused on the doorstep. "You seem happy," she said. Her voice was carefully neutral. "I'm doing okay," I said, which was true, and which was not the same as what she had said, and she noticed the difference. The return attempt, when it came, was gradual enough that I might have missed its shape if I hadn't been paying attention. It began with a shift in message frequency, from every few days to daily, then to multiple times a day. The content changed too. Less about logistics, more personal. She began referencing shared memories. A restaurant we'd loved. A trip we'd taken in the third year. Small, specific things that were clearly chosen for their weight. She was constructing a case from nostalgia, presenting evidence of a shared history as if it constituted a plan for the future. Then she asked if we could have dinner. Just us. She had something she wanted to talk about. I said yes. I said it because our daughter existed and because Camille and I would be in each other's lives for the foreseeable future regardless of what we were or weren't to each other, and the nature of that coexistence mattered. I also said yes because I wanted to understand what she was going to say, and because I was, by then, stable enough that understanding it wouldn't cost me anything I couldn't afford. The dinner was at a restaurant she'd chosen. Not the one from the shared memories, but a new place, careful and slightly formal. The venue of someone who wanted the setting to signal seriousness without triggering familiarity. She was dressed with the same deliberate effortlessness I'd noticed in the home visits. She smiled when I arrived, and the smile had too much in it. We ordered. We talked about our daughter for the first 10 minutes. Then Camille put her glass down and said, "I made a mistake." I waited. I thought I needed to step back from everything to figure out what I wanted. I convinced myself that the distance would give me clarity. She paused. It didn't. Or it gave me clarity I wasn't expecting. Another pause. "I know what I want, Elliot. I know it now in a way I didn't before." She was looking at me with the expression of someone who had delivered the crucial line and was now waiting for the scene to unfold in the expected direction. I recognized the structure of the moment. I had been the person who would have responded to that structure, once. Who would have felt the emotional weight of it and moved toward it, because that was the pattern, her threshold, my response, the cycle continuing. "I'm glad you have clarity," I said. She blinked. "That's Elliot. I mean that," I said. Genuinely. "I know that was a hard period. I'm glad something useful came out of it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm telling you I want to come back. I know you are." And I looked at her across the table. This woman I had loved, whose handwriting I knew better than my own, who had left a letter in a cookbook and our daughter in a bassinet and asked for space to find her footing. I thought about the gym 20 minutes away. I thought about Weston. I thought about the breadcrumb messages designed to maintain my orbit while she figured out whether something else would work. I thought about the expression on her face in the doorway when she'd heard me laughing on the phone. "I don't think you want to come back to me," I said, keeping my voice level. "I think you want to come back to the version of things where you were the one with options. And those aren't the same." She looked as though I had said something in a language she'd been certain she understood. "That's not fair," she said. "Maybe not," I said. "But I think it's true. The silence that followed was long enough that the waiter came and went. She looked at the table. She looked at the window. When she looked back at me, there was something different in her expression. Not the performance, not the deliberate effortlessness. Something rawer, almost genuinely confused. "When did you change?" she said. "I didn't change," I said. "I just stopped waiting." Then came the complication I had not anticipated. She told me, in that same raw register, that she was pregnant. 10 weeks. And that she did not know, with certainty, whether it was mine. I sat very still. She said she had ended things with Weston 2 months ago. She said she hadn't known what to do. She said she was telling me now because she thought I deserved to know, and because she wanted to try, and because she was frightened. I said I would need a paternity test. I said it without anger. I said it as the only rational sentence available in the circumstances. She said yes. Of course. Whatever I needed. I paid for the dinner. I drove home. I sat in the apartment that had been repainted and reorganized and no longer contained a cookbook, and I sat with the information in the particular way you sit with something that is large and complicated and must be approached one piece at a time. The test, when it came back 6 weeks later, showed the child was not mine. There are moments that work as hinges, moments where the door swings and the space on the other side becomes visible. The paternity result was one of them. Not because it answered a question I had been desperate to resolve, but because it closed a door I might otherwise have stood near for longer than was good for me. It removed the last structural reason to remain in a holding pattern. Whatever Camille and I were going to be, whatever our lives were going to look like going forward, it was not going to be shaped by an obligation that turned out not to exist. I called Camille when I had the result. I told her clearly and without cruelty. She was silent for a long time on the other end. Then she said she was sorry. I said I knew she was. I said, "Let's talk about how we do this for our daughter." And we did. What followed was not simple, but it was workable. We arranged a formal co-parenting structure, regular schedules, shared decisions, the architecture of two people who are no longer together but who are permanently bound by someone they love. A lawyer was involved, briefly. The language of the agreement was dry and precise and contained nothing about how we'd felt about each other, which was appropriate. Camille was difficult in patches. There were moments when the practicality slipped and the old dynamics tried to reassert themselves. Manipulation at the edges, a tendency to frame her choices as my failures, the periodic recurrence of the return narrative dressed in new language. I had learned, by then, to recognize those moments early and to hold my ground without escalating them. Not coldly, just firmly. There was one afternoon in February when she arrived to collect our daughter and stood in the hallway for a long time not leaving, not saying anything useful, just occupying the space in the specific way of someone who wants to be asked to stay. I said her name, gently, and held the door. She looked at me for a moment with an expression that I thought I recognized, something honest behind the performance, something that might have been grief or regret, or the belated recognition of the cost of choices made quickly and for the wrong reasons. I didn't say anything about that. I just held the door. Kara and I had dinner for the first time properly, just the two of us, in a way that was something other than friendship, in the spring. She knew the broad contours of what I had been through. She didn't treat it as luggage or as a story she needed the full details of. She treated it as the context of a person she was interested in knowing, which is a different thing entirely. What I felt in those early evenings with Kara was not the intensity of what I had built with Camille, not the years of accumulated history, the weight of shared decisions, the texture of a long shared life. It was something quieter and, in its quietness, more honest. It was the feeling of being present in the actual current moment rather than performing a version of myself constructed for someone else's needs. I don't know what it becomes. I am genuinely, for the first time in years, comfortable not knowing. My daughter is 18 months old now. She has learned to point at things she wants, which is the most efficient form of communication I've encountered, and I try to take notes. She has her mother's eyes and what I hope is her father's patience. And she is growing in the particular relentless way of small children who don't yet know they're supposed to find existence difficult. I look at her and feel something I don't have a name for that is larger than love. I think about the letter in the cookbook sometimes. Not with bitterness. I have found that bitterness, like most emotions held past their useful period, just becomes noise. I think about it with a kind of removed curiosity, the way you think about a version of yourself that seems slightly foreign now. The man who stood at the kitchen counter and read those 2 pages and folded them precisely along their original creases. He didn't know yet that the folding was already an act of something. Not closure exactly, but the beginning of the decision to maintain himself in the middle of disorder. Everything after that was just working out the details. Elliot's story is structured around a deceptively simple reversal. A woman who expected to retain control of a situation she had initiated, and a man who quietly chose not to remain in the position she had assigned him. To understand why this matters psychologically, you have to start with Camille's internal logic. She did not leave because the relationship was unbearable. She left because she wanted freedom without loss, the option to explore what Weston represented while keeping Elliot available as a stable point of return. The breadcrumb messages, the carefully timed visits, the escalating contact precisely when Elliot's distance became apparent. These are not the behaviors of someone working through genuine confusion. They are the behaviors of someone managing an outcome. At what point, do you think, did this stop being a personal crisis and become a strategy? Elliot's blind spot, for most of the relationship, was patience misread as passivity. He absorbed Camille's increasing withdrawal, the gym routine, the phone behavior, the emotional distance, and assigned each piece a charitable explanation. This is not naivety. It is the particular vulnerability of someone who trusts so completely that doubt feels like a betrayal of its own. The lesson this surface is one many people in long relationships recognize. The same capacity for trust that makes love sustainable can also make it slow to defend itself. The turning point isn't the confrontation at dinner or even the paternity result. It comes earlier, in the quiet moment after Camille leaves, when Elliot makes the decision to stop treating the apartment as a place on pause. Repainting the hallway, reorganizing the kitchen, throwing away the cookbook. These are not dramatic gestures. They are small, deliberate acts of self-reclamation, and they signal something more significant than coping. They signal that he had stopped waiting for permission to continue his own life. Camille's return attempt reveals the flaw in her original calculation. She had assumed that Elliot's stability would hold, that he would be where she left him, emotionally available, willing to re-enter the narrative on her terms. The expression in the doorway when she heard him laughing on the phone is one of the story's most psychologically honest moments. She wasn't witnessing happiness. She was witnessing independence. And for someone who had unconsciously organized the relationship around being the one with options, that independence was destabilizing in a way she hadn't prepared for. The dinner confrontation is important precisely because Elliot doesn't perform it. He doesn't punish, doesn't recount grievances, doesn't ask for explanations she was never going to give honestly. He simply names what he sees. You want to come back to the version of things where you were the one with options. That sentence is not cruelty. It is clarity. And clarity, in a dynamic built on managed ambiguity, is the most disruptive thing possible. The lesson that emerges from this is worth sitting with. Emotional recovery is not a passive process. Elliot didn't heal by waiting for the wound to close. He headed by actively redirecting his attention toward his own life, his daughter, his work, Kara, the small domestic acts of repossessing a space that had started to feel like someone else's waiting room. Recovery moved at exactly the pace of his willingness to invest in the present rather than the lost version of the past. Camille's behavior across the arc of this story reflects a psychological pattern that is less about cruelty than about a deep discomfort with irreversibility. She left in a way that preserved optionality. She maintained contact in a way that preserved orbit. She returned not because she had resolved her uncertainty, but because Elliot's independence removed the safety net she hadn't acknowledged needing. This is the accumulation effect in its clearest form. The relationship didn't collapse because of one catastrophic event. It collapsed through the gradual erosion of reciprocity. The gym that moved further away, the phone that turned over, the name mentioned once and never again. Small separations that accumulated into a structural distance, neither of them named until she put it in a letter and left it in a cookbook. What Elliot's arc ultimately represents is the paradox of detachment as reconnection. By releasing his orientation toward Camille, not in anger but in the simple act of resuming his own life, he became, for the first time in the story, fully present. Present to his daughter. Present to the possibility of Kara. present to himself in a way that the long habit of organizing around another person had obscured. The paternity result functions in the story not as a dramatic revelation, but as a structural release, the final piece of information that made certain things permanently unavailable, and in doing so freed both of them from the ambiguity they had been inhabiting. It didn't answer the deeper question of what the relationship had been, but it answered the practical question of what it could now become. What they became was co-parents. Not enemies, not strangers, not the romantic partners one of them still wanted to recover. Just two people permanently bound by a small girl who points at things she wants with complete confidence, and who does not yet know how much courage that takes. What stays with me about Elliot's story is not the betrayal or the confrontation, it's the hallway. The moment Camille stood there not leaving, not speaking, just occupying the space in the way of someone who needed to be asked to stay. And Elliot simply held the door. No speech, no cruelty, no closure speech. Just the quiet dignity of a man who had learned, through months of genuinely hard work, that presence without invitation is not love, it's a habit. And habits, unlike love, can be gently declined. We talk a lot about how to survive betrayal. We talk less about the harder thing, how to stop organizing your life around the person who caused it, even when part of you still wants to. That's the real work. That's what the repainted hallway was about.